So first, we're going to hear from the candidates in Ward 2, Jordan Grossman, Patrick Kennedy, and Kishan Putta in that order. And then after that, Janeese Lewis George, who is running in Ward 4. Each candidate will have 5 minutes to introduce themselves and make their pitch, and 5 minutes to answer a couple questions from Hub members. To ask a question, put it in the chat, making sure it is going to everyone and not just the host. And Mark or Jessica will call on you to unmute yourself and ask it if there is time. Please start putting questions in the chat while candidates are speaking. It will allow us to get to more of them. If there are questions we don't get to that people really want to ask, I'm sure that the campaigns would be happy to answer them through email afterwards. And then after we hear from the candidates, we will have a Hub members only discussion about what we heard and how we want to move forward. So with that, I'm excited to introduce the first candidate, Jordan Grossman. Jordan, take it away.
Thanks, Jeremy. And thank you guys so much for organizing this. I'm really excited for the opportunity. For those of you I haven't met yet, my name is Jordan Grossman. I'm a 5th generation DC resident. I've spent my entire career in public service, basically trying to move our government in a more progressive direction. That's actually why I'm so proud to have the endorsements of many of DC's progressive leaders, from Councilmember Alyssa Silverman, your partners at 350 DC, the DC chapter of the National Organization for Women, the Nonprofit Professional Employees Union, DC Working Families, and a bunch of other folks as well. And you know, from my career working in public service, I worked for President Obama, for the DC Medicaid Agency, on Capitol Hill, and for a DC federal judge. I know that it's really a privilege. It's not a business opportunity. And we here in Ward 2 have had to compete over the last 30 years for the time and attention of our council member with special interests that could afford his price. So just to take a step back, for those of you who don't know much about Jack Evans, who's represented us for 30 years, resigned and is now running again, he actually worked as a special interest lobbyist for many of the years that he was our elected member of the DC Council. So he was taking hundreds of thousands of dollars from these special interests, which included Pepco, our biggest fossil fuel company, at the same time that he was on the council. And they had all this business before the council. And he didn't publicly disclose these folks. And look, I just think that is fundamentally wrong. It's a big reason why I have taken the Green New Deal pledge and why I took the No Pepco pledge. Because I think our politics should be about making people's lives better, not about paying special interests. You shouldn't have to compete with special interests who pay your elected official for their time and attention. And look, I think it goes to, it's not just that Jack was so personally corrupt, right? That's horrible and shameless on its own, but I just don't think we can achieve the kind of ambitious climate goals that we have if we have the same old special interest political machine approach, right? So we can't, I don't think, achieve the full goals of creating millions of new green jobs and actually making a dent in our climate change and the trend we are on climate change if we still have Pepco having backroom deals and meetings with members of the DC Council. We're not going to be able to achieve things like a Green New Deal for public housing or a true people's bailout in the midst of this coronavirus, or actually get a comprehensive network of protected bike lanes, protected bus lanes, or truly implement the historic Clean Energy DC law. Like, let's take that Clean Energy DC law for example, right? It's a great law. We got so much passed in it, but you know what? Pepco behind the scenes was gutting key provisions like requiring DC to engage in power purchase agreements. That would have cut 10% of our emissions, but Pepco behind the scenes got that removed from the legislation. So look, I think there are so many things we want to do when it comes to affordable housing, environmental justice, and creating a truly sustainable city, but we cannot do it unless we have a clean break from that Jack Evans special interest approach to politics. And look, my first job was as a field organizer for Barack Obama's presidential campaign in 2008. I'm an organizer at heart, and our campaign is about meeting people where they are and organizing. I know that's something that is very familiar to those of you in the Sunrise Hub, right? And you know, I know you all have a value of meeting people where they are. That's something that we feel very strongly in our campaign too. in the midst of COVID-19, where people are has changed. It's online, it's through text, it's through other things, but our values and our principles haven't changed. They're more important than ever. And so in our campaign, we've reached out to thousands of people. We knocked thousands of doors before COVID. We've reached out individually to thousands more people since in virtual ways. But these campaigns are more than one person. They're more than fundraising. They're about people power. And if there's anything that I know about Sunrise, it is about bringing people power to bear to build a more progressive and equitable and sustainable future. And so that's why I'm so excited by the opportunity to speak with you all. I really would be honored to have your endorsement. I think you guys would be incredible force multipliers, but ultimately I want to work with you on the council so we can build that future that we all want and truly make a difference and truly make a clean break from that special interest approach to politics. So thank you so much. I hope I didn't run over my time there.
Not right on time. Thanks, Jordan. And if people could put questions in the chat, we'll have 5 minutes for Jordan to answer them.
People are being shy. All right, I see some now.
Okay, so I'll go ahead and I see there is one from Rohan. You can go ahead and unmute yourself and ask your question.
Hi, I'm wondering what sort of opposition you anticipate receiving from the special interests you mentioned, or even from other council members to actually make kind of serious reforms or changes through the council.
I think it's a great question. I think what we're going to see, there's twofold. One, if I'm going to talk about clean energy DC, and then two more broad legislation we can get. On clean energy DC, one thing I've learned from working in 2 different federal agencies and in a DC agency is that a lot of times where implementation really happens, it's not just passing the law, that's just the beginning. It's not the end. And so many members of the council think of it as the end. Where especially special interests work the best is in the implementation and getting laws implemented in a way that isn't actually the way that is intended, right? So the things that I'm looking at that I think we're gonna have to be fighting special interests on, building energy performance standards, for example. There's still some things that in that law are kicked to the agency to establish and decide. And we're gonna need to keep fighting to make sure the integrity of that law and that vision is actually implemented, because buildings are huge part of our emissions in DC. I think it's something like 3/4 of our emissions. And so that's one area. And the second piece is how do we go further, right, in terms of passing more legislation. So one thing that didn't get covered in Clean Energy DC was things like Uber and Lyft, making sure they're using, moving to low emission or no emission vehicles. One thing that got taken out was power purchasing agreements, like I mentioned, or also other fleets of vehicles, things like FedEx or other folks that operate throughout our city, but are sort of, it's unclear if they're going to be covered. And you can imagine companies like FedEx or UPS or something have teams of lobbyists and have a lot of relationships. So I think that's sort of the type of thing we're going to find if we're going to try to make these real big breaks. And the last thing I will say is I'm, an extremely pro-worker, pro-labor person. And I think one thing we're going to see is as we try to build on these sort of Green New Deal type of legislation, part of that is that they're good jobs, right? It's not just moving in a green direction, it's moving in a sustainable economic direction. We're in the midst of this economic calamity in addition to health calamity. And I think you're going to see more and more of a push for, oh, we got to cut that, or oh, we can't afford to pay people a living wage, or make sure we can't afford to do all this stuff. Personally, I think it's more important than ever to put workers and people first and not sort of the broader, special interests first. But that's going to be a key fight, I think, as we recover from COVID.
Thanks very much.
Awesome. I see a question here from Alexis. You can go ahead and unmute yourself and ask your question.
Hi there. Sorry about that. Yeah, I would love to hear if you think that rent cancellation is necessary during the COVID-19 crisis, and how you feel about the Reclaim Rent Control platform as a permanent solution to the crisis that predates COVID-19.
Yes, great question. I'll take the second one first. I was really happy to be at the Reclaim Rent Control rally that when Councilmember Nadeau committed to introducing the platform as legislation in the council. If I were on the council, I would support it. I think I've signed on to it. I think there's some just like basic things that in the platform that people, COVID or not COVID, like you should not get basically a bonus if you kick someone out of their rent controlled apartment. That's basically what a vacancy increase is. Like, I don't understand why that exists. We shouldn't have a date that's, 30, 40, 50 years in the past that's static. So we keep losing thousands of units of rent control year after year. And even one thing I really appreciate about the Reclaim Rent Control platform is even beyond units that are currently in rent control, making it so that no unit can rent be increased more than once a year. So I think the Reclaim Rent Control Coalition is doing fantastic work. It's an incredible coalition, and I think it is a huge part of what we need to do. I think we're in a housing crisis overall, even before COVID. Ed Lazier, who's was at the DC Fiscal Policy Institute, said, and I think this is so true, the DC Council only spends about 3% of its budget on housing issues. Well, it's way more than 3% of our challenges. And so we need to do more for people experiencing homelessness, the environmental justice calamity that is our public housing, do more to help people with rent control, do more on the local rent supplement program, the DC Housing Production Trust Fund, reforming the comprehensive plan, and on and on and on. So I know we have tight times. So I could talk about housing for another hour, but I want to get to the first part of your question. I think we absolutely need to address rent for people in COVID. It just doesn't make sense. I know we have this moratorium on evictions, which is great first step. But the idea that then once the public health emergency is over, then people are just going to get evicted left and right. That's just not sustainable. And so to me, the mechanism is we have to make sure we get people, whatever recovery efforts we have, we need to get money to people and get them help. And whether that's through rent cancellation or it may be easier to give people vouchers or whatever it is, it's got to go. We got to make sure people are not getting evicted en masse just once this public health emergency is over.
Thanks again for coming onto the call and answering those questions. I know we didn't get to all of them, but feel free for the people who asked them to follow up. Maybe we'll just collect them at the end and send them to the campaigns. But also I encourage you all to check out the candidate guide that we put together, which includes a link to the questionnaires that the campaign's already filled out, which has a lot of information in them. So thanks, Jordan. And we're gonna move now to Patrick Kennedy.
Well, thank you very much, Jeremy, and thanks to everybody in Sunrise for having me and for considering me among your final cut of candidates in the Ward 2 race. I really appreciate the opportunity and your time. Just a little bit of background about myself. I actually got my start in DC as a college student at GW. I moved up here 10 years ago from Florida originally and came to GW, I think, with a strong interest, like a lot of people who come to DC, very much in a public interest focus, right? I wanted to do government service of some kind because I think that's the broadest way that you can make an impact. What I saw very quickly when I got here was that you can really have a tremendous impact by getting involved in your community and getting involved in local government. So when I was a sophomore actually at GW, I founded a group that was dedicated to getting college students more involved in local politics, local government in their community. We got people engaged, we did voter registration campaigns, and as a result of that, we actually got 3 students elected to the ANC in Foggy Bottom back in 2012. Of the 3, I'm the only one that's still left because I'm the only one that's just stayed in place for the last 8 years. But we've done a lot of really great things in that time, and I think that especially having that balance of students on the Foggy Bottom ANC has pushed us in a more progressive direction. And we've really been leaders in a lot of advocacy around different efforts over the years. I remember my first year on the commission, we pushed a resolution supporting fossil fuel divestment. That is to take DC's pension funds and basically divest from fossil fuel companies. I was elected the ANC's chair when I was a senior. And one of the things that we tackled my second year as chair in particular was being a very forceful advocate against the Pepco-Exelon merger. I think we actually passed 2 resolutions doubling down on our position with that because this is ultimately something that translates to our residents, right? If you have a forward-looking vision, if you can stand up and do the right thing, and you can stand up for the interests of both older and younger residents, there is so much that people can align on. And that's really what I found in Foggy Bottom, because there was a lot of skepticism, I think, when I was getting involved as a young person, when I was elected at 21. There were a lot of people who were older who didn't, necessarily have a level of comfort with a young person representing them. And I think what we proved is that it is possible. It is possible to work together, and it's possible to do, I think, really great things from an advocacy standpoint. I still say the best job that I've ever had actually was the summer I worked at Metro. I've had a lifelong passion, love, and interest in public transportation. I think it's so central, especially as we think about Green New Deals and the sort of investments that we need to make to reduce transportation emissions and enable people to live a more sustainable lifestyle. Investments in public transportation are so central in that. So every time we have the opportunity to push things like dedicated bus lanes on H&I streets, dedicated bus lanes on 16th Street, improvements in service frequency, even into the really boring details of how often the buses are going to run and where they're stored and what the fleet mix is and whether it's electric or not. I mean, these are really the sorts of policy areas where we're ultimately going to meet our Green New Deal goals or we're not. And I think by advocating at the local level, we've really been able to make a lot of positive improvements over the years, just at that local level for our community, and the dividend benefit has just multiplied all over. For my part, it's a challenge to stay in my district. I love my neighborhood. I love serving at the community level. I spend more than half of my income on rent. So the housing situation to me that we face in the city is very personal. I have outstanding student loan payments. So to me, I'm reminded of my debt to GW every month when I write the $277 check. So, to me, these things aren't really abstract concepts, but nor are the solutions, because I think that we've been able to achieve a lot of positive things at the same time. And it's taken working with people, and it's taken really developing a record of knowledge of the players in the city government, the policies in particular. There is nothing that's too boring or detail oriented for me when it comes to a lot of these things. So when we're thinking about the sorts of investments we need to make and the sorts of requirements we need to put on Washington Gas as far as capturing methane emissions and cutting off new sources of gas installations in building. The building that I'm sitting in right now is an 80-year-old building. It's enormously inefficient. It is all gas, the appliances. So looking at our building code to make sure that we move to more sustainable buildings moving forward. All of these things that are building blocks of building a green city and really putting Green New Deal principles into practice at the local level is what I've been fighting for the last 8 years. And I'm proud to have been endorsed by the Sierra Club. I'm proud to have been endorsed by Greater Washington, where I've been a contributor for a number of years. And I'm proud to have been endorsed by community leaders all across the board, because I really do think that it's important not just to have, I think, the best of intentions, but to really be able to work with people to put a lot of these things into practice. And I'm very proud of what we've been able to do at the local level to that end. I will close before I take questions, by really emphasizing how much these sorts of movements mean in terms of pressuring the council to do the right thing, in terms of being a vocal constituency. It really does matter. And I think there's a changing of the guard going on in this city. I think the 3 people who are on this call from Ward 2 are an outstanding testament to that. We're all using fair elections, so we're not taking, corporate money, PAC money, LLC money. We're really about, I think, running campaigns that are centered in the communities themselves. And I'm proud to have, the most support from Ward 2 donors of anyone in the race. It's really enabled us, I think, to run a campaign that's very much centered in the communities here. And that's really what I believe in, is about building from the bottom up, engaging at the community level. And that's ultimately, I think, how we can achieve, even when the federal government is gridlocked, a lot of difference-making changes at the local level. So happy to open things up to questions on that basis, but I'm really grateful for the opportunity, and thank you so much for your consideration.
Great, thank you, Patrick. So it looks like we've already got a bunch of questions for you as well. And so I'd like to open it up to Ren. Why don't you go ahead and ask yours?
Sure, thanks so much for joining us, Patrick. We were just wondering, what are some of your reasons for not signing on to the No Pepco pledge?
Yeah, I appreciate that question, and it has come up at a prior debate. I think with the Pepco pledge, I will say there are 2 things in that are very straightforward and easy for me, which is supporting the alternative energy model study and not taking money from the corporation or any of the people who work there. I don't have money from anybody who's worked at Pepco. I think that in terms of understanding the balance between, the issues and how to actually implement things, you have to be sensitive to the context of the conversations that take place at the Wilson building. And so my concern with the pledge very specifically was around one element that was focused on meetings. I think that frankly, when I meet with any sort of advocacy group, and I talk to 350 before I make that pledge, when I talk to any resident, when I talk to anybody, I think those people, I'm not going to tell anybody at PEPCO what you tell me if you have a meeting just head to head or any other advocacy group. I mean, I think that confidentiality is how you get the best information from people. I think elected officials have a responsibility to be transparent in their decision making. I've certainly been transparent over the years in opposing PEPCO on virtually every occasion that they've come to us with a policy case or a rate making case. But I've also had the obligation as an elected official to have to work with them. And I know that the Sierra Club right now, for instance, is working with them to try and get electric charging stations installed as electrical infrastructure on the streets, sort of like how the parking meters are installed. And for my part, I have constituents who, when PEPCO jackhammers at midnight or 12:30 in the morning, they come to me and say, can you work with these people and get this shut off? And so there's a tricky balance in that. And I respect why they asked for that in the pledge. My experience, working at the ANC level and working in government over the last several years, though, is that, when you impose those sorts of restrictions on conversations, you really aren't able to work with them effectively at all. And they just work around you and go somewhere else. And far from being more transparent, they just become deeper and more embedded in the system and more pernicious. But I think there's absolutely a responsibility on the part of elected officials to be transparent about their decision making, transparent about the fact that they're taking the meetings, and they ought to explain their decision to you, whatever the ultimate outcome of that is. And I think that I'm unique in this race for having the record of opposing the PEPCO Exelon merger and a lot of other things. And I have 8 years worth of track record and results, I think, to demonstrate what centers me and what will centers me on council.
Great, thanks, Patrick. So just one, I think we might have time for one more question right now. And for that, I'll open it up to Evan.
Hi, Patrick. Thank you for that. So I was just curious, in your survey response, you said that you supported increasing, reduced fare Metro cards for students and people who can't afford Metro fares. And you said that you were open to the idea of removing fares completely, but that you thought it maybe should be paired with a congestion tax. So I'm just curious if you could clarify a little bit more on that. What would have to happen before you would support eliminating fares completely?
Well, yeah, I think that's a great question, because our public transportation system here is like nowhere else in the country, in that we don't directly control Metro. To get anything done, you have to have Virginia and Maryland and the federal government on board with it. And what free Metro fares in the DC area in effect amount to is, we have to pay Metro for the fare revenue that they're not receiving through that process. So you have to come up with the amount of fare revenue that they would lose in order to keep running the amount of service that they're running today. So I actually think, since we filled out these questionnaires, I don't remember the specific timing when they were due, but since I think we filled them out, Councilmember Allen came up with a proposal that I think is really ingenious, to provide $100 per transit user subsidy to all district residents every month. And I really like that idea, because it doesn't subject, we can essentially put forward a policy in DC that promotes essentially free transit fares for the vast majority of our population by giving them that smart trip subsidy. But we don't have to get Maryland's approval for it. We don't have to get Virginia's approval for it. We don't have to get the Fed's approval for it. We can just make that investment ourselves. You're still going to have to ultimately come up with the money for that. I think the best way to do that is to implement a congestion charge, perhaps in conjunction with other things to make it whole. But by introducing a congestion charge, you are imposing a cost on the negative externality of people driving, single occupant automobiles into the central business district and creating the traffic congestion. And if you think about the type of behavior that disincentivizes, if traffic is reduced as a consequence of that, you're making bus trips more quick. You are ultimately facilitating people using public transportation as a choice. It's about creating a structure, and I think this is so central to making sure that the Green New Deal comes into practice. It's about creating the right set of incentives and disincentives to get people to use the system and to come up with the revenue to pay for it. Because I think, unfortunately, unlike the federal government, the district and metro, we ultimately have to balance out our costs and revenues at the end of the year. I think the best way to do that is do it in a progressive way and in a way that embeds the types of policies that we would otherwise want to implement anyway, just for environmental reasons, and to encourage, I think, the type of city that we want to be, where we make investments in these public infrastructures like metro that are accessible to all, and that are achievable and really that are economically something that everybody can afford to take.
Thanks, Patrick. So I know it feels like we can probably only get to 2 questions per candidate right now, but we're also moving pretty quickly. So if the candidates have time to stay on for a bit after the other 2 candidates go, I think that we will take questions up until 7:45 after Janeese goes.
Yeah,
so
thank you very much for the opportunity. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for coming. So next we have Kishan Putta.
Thanks, Jeremy, Danny, Garrett, Anna, Ren, Naeem, Lucy, Zach, Erica, Allison, everyone else on the call. Thank you for taking time out of your schedules tonight. My name is Kishan Putta, and I want to start off by sharing one of my favorite quotes in politics. And that quote is, "People don't care what you know until they know that you care and why you care." So tonight, I want to start off by telling you why I care so much about these issues. My mother and father were born in villages in rural India. They didn't have running water or electricity. They immigrated to America, and my father became an environmental engineer for the government, working his whole career on reducing carbon emissions and on energy conservations. Lessons that I internalized, my whole family internalized. We here in DC in our home, we compost weekly. We have a rain barrel to protect our rivers. My wife is vegetarian and is converting me slowly. We're raising our son vegetarian, and we use public transportation and bike as much as we can as well. But also in our public service, I've internalized these lessons as well. For the last 15 years, I have been working on healthcare policy in DC, and for the last 6 years, working for DC government, implementing President Obama's healthcare law, trying to help people get access to health coverage and healthcare services here in DC. I'm very proud. We have cut DC's uninsured rate in half, and we have the 2nd lowest uninsured rate in the nation. The coverage that is very helpful right now during the public health crisis that we're facing. In fact, because of these achievements, Ward 2 resident has endorsed me, who I'm very proud to have his endorsement. That's President Obama's Surgeon General, Vivek Murthy. I'll just add in that Vivek says that I am the candidate who's best positioned to help our city recover from this health and economic crisis. Another endorsement I want to mention, also from Ward 2, the Environmental Protection Agency's General Counsel, Kevin Minoli, has also endorsed me in this race. So I'm very proud of those endorsements. Both of those Ward 2 residents always tell me about the links between climate change and healthcare. And I'm so glad that, that your organization recognizes those links as well. We see it all the time. I've been working for years on healthcare disparities and talking about it, but now people are finally listening during this crisis. As you've heard, around the country and in our city, African Americans are dying at a much higher proportion than the rest of the population. And this is untenable. In our city, just miles away from where we live, it's such a different condition. And I have worked in the poorest communities of DC for years, in wards 5, 7, 8, east of the river, with the low-income immigrant communities of this city. As you said in your questionnaire, children facing much higher rates of asthma because of poor housing conditions, because of higher temperatures, because of heat islands in our cities that we can do something about, and we must do something about. And I have a record of actually working to improve these issues. And so I've seen it with my own eyes through healthcare. I will say in the immigrant community, our council is one of the few cities that doesn't have any immigrants or children of immigrants serving on it. In a city of over 25% immigrants or children of immigrants, I would be the first Asian American elected to our council. And I believe that that community, the immigrant community of our city, deserves to have their voices represented and their perspectives represented. I'll just end on my record. I'm the only candidate to have been elected in 2 different parts of Ward 2, in DuPont Circle and now in Georgetown. And I've gotten a lot of things done on these issues. On green buildings, we got a LEED Platinum design, a net zero building at the Stead Park Community Center with a huge solar array. We got on green infrastructure, right outside in the alley, right outside this window, and all over my neighborhood. I worked very hard to get permeable pavement so that stormwater doesn't flood and pollute our rivers. I worked on public transportation the most for years, improving busing for thousands of people on 16th Street. I stood out in the cold, put up posters, and held meetings, and we got more buses, longer buses, and 8 years later, after struggling and begging, we finally got the city. This year, they're going to commit and finally build the dedicated bus lanes on 16th Street that every other progressive city in the Northeast has. And it's going to help thousands of people give up their cars, take the bus, which is going to be faster than driving. And so that's why they're going to take the bus. And I will push on public transportation and on safer streets, protected bike lanes that I got on 15th Street as well. I have results to show it. I haven't just talked about it. And I will prioritize these issues for you. That it's easy to talk. It's another thing to prioritize and get results. And I want to get more results for you if you give me the chance. Thank you for your time and for your consideration.
Thank you, Kishan. I'm going to go to Alice. Could you go ahead and ask your question?
Sure. So I used to work in the solar industry and am very familiar with the SREC market here, and it's the strongest SREC market. But I'm wondering more what you think of the energy justice implications of like these market-based solutions. So first, I was wondering if you consider renewable energy credits to be an effective method of promoting solar installation. And then second, I was wondering what methods you would suggest to track the distribution of these renewable energy credits, who's earning the most from them? Is it developers? Is it people who are homeowners? And ensuring an equitable distribution of the benefits of renewable energy.
Alice, thanks so much for the question. I've followed this issue for years. I'm no expert on it, but I do remember early on being so puzzled why the Republican Party, which championed such policies and projects, much like on Obamacare, which I do know a lot more about market. They first pushed these market-based solutions and then they backed away from them, which I think shows that they don't actually care. But I want to say that on the tax credits, on the credits, you're right to raise the issues of equity, and it's not just anyone who can afford this. And we want to make solar accessible for anyone who wants it. There are homeowners in all parts of this city with all different income levels, and solar shouldn't just be for the wealthy. I've pushed to make it easier to put solar panels on your roofs. In DuPont Circle, where I was an ANC commissioner, there are many people of higher income, but not everyone is. And the regulations that they had to deal with were in so many cases untenable, whether it be historic or otherwise. And I worked to push for common sense solutions. I'm very proud that DC has moved towards making it easier to put solar on your roofs. I'll add one other thing that I've heard. People who fix their own roofs, I've been hearing this more and more. People have old roofs in the city, old buildings, old roofs. When they fix their roofs, the new roof comes with a warranty that gets voided by putting on solar panels subsequently. And it's the reason a lot of people don't put solar panels on their roofs. And that's sad. That is a missed opportunity. Many people who want to do it aren't doing it. That's where government should come in. And so I would try to help work with those warranties, have a government solution to re-guarantee those roofs so that people can put solar panels on them. I want you to know that I do care a lot about it. And I would like to learn even more about the specifics of the credits that you're talking about. But you have someone here who prioritizes people of all income having access to these roofs, whether it's subsidies or reforms to those markets. I want to make it work. Thank you, Alice.
Okay, we're going to move over to Matthew with your question.
Hi, yeah, I was wondering what your plan is to get DC to carbon neutrality.
Okay. Well, that's a big and important question, and I'm committed to it. We passed ambitious legislation, but one problem we have in DC that I've noticed as a commissioner and as a resident like yourself, I'm sure you've noticed it too. We too often pass great progressive laws, and then we fail to fund them, fail to enforce them. And what's the point, right? So that's where we come in. That's where I would come in as a council member. I have a passion for oversight, a very wonky passion for government and budget oversight. I have testified before the DC Council over 30 times on performance oversight hearings, budget oversight hearings. I know it's a little crazy, but really, mostly it's because it was one of the few ways to actually get them to listen to you. You could email every day, you could call every day, but until they see you dragged in front of their council member, and then the council member asks them a question in front of live TV, then they feel the pressure. And I've noticed that early on in my career, and so that's why I went back. I kept going back, and so I know how oversight works. I have a passion for it. I've done it as a commissioner. I've done it as a public citizen, and I want to do it on the council. I'll be tough on making sure we enforce these laws. We've got to make sure that our buildings, as Jordan mentioned, buildings are such a huge source of emissions. My father would be the first to agree. Green buildings is something I not only talk about and care about, but actually have experience with. As I mentioned, at Stead Park, which is on P Street between 17th and 16th, I've been on the board for I guess 8 years now, and we first got the field fixed up. You might have played soccer there or kickball, but now we're getting the old rec center redeveloped with $15 million. We got 10 initially. We said that's not enough to make this as great as the community deserves. We got another 5, and we're now going to make it a net zero with a huge solar array, and a LEED Platinum building. And I want to take that approach and make sure that all of our buildings are set to a higher standard. That would make a big dent towards that. There's a lot of other things, but I know you have other candidates to get to, but I'd be happy to talk about it later on this call or offline. You can go to my website, kishanfordc.com, KISHANFORDC.com. Contact me on social media, Kishan for DC, and I and my team will definitely stay in touch with all of you. Thank you so much, everybody, for listening, and I hope to interact with you and see you in person when when the world allows us to again. But until then, I'll be working on these issues as a healthcare professional and as a commissioner, and I'll work more on it for you and for our whole city. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Kishan. I think we're going to try to get one or two more questions for all the candidates at the end. But also thanks to all the Ward 2 candidates for going. And then last but not least, we have from Ward 4, Janeese Lewis George. So Janeese, take it away.
Hi, how are you? Can you see me? My computer.
Yep.
Okay, great. Hi, everyone. My name is Janeese Lewis George. I want to thank you for having me and thank you for this opportunity. I am running for the Ward 4 Council seat in the June 2nd election. For me, I come to you from a place of understanding that we cannot talk about environmental justice issues without talking about racial justice issues, without talking about economic justice issues, without talking about social justice issues. And the reason that is the case is because the reason I came to have a passion for environmental justice issues actually came out of my own family's personal struggle. One of my cousin, Rainice, actually, who I am named after, fell ill to asthma. She was living in public housing in Northeast. And when we got the call that night that she had succumbed to her asthma and she passed away, as a family, we were angry and we were figuring out what happened, what went wrong. And why didn't she have her inhaler? Why didn't she, why didn't we get to her in time? And as I've grown older, I started to realize that the problems that my cousin Rainice faced, the inequities that she faced, contributed to that. And the reality is that we're seeing it right now, even in COVID-19, that Black and brown families are more susceptible to asthma, are more susceptible to heart conditions and hypertension, and that puts them at a disadvantage when it comes to where we are in this crisis. And so for me, I come to this environmental justice conversation through my fight for racial justice issues. A little bit of background about me: I am born and raised here in DC, a third generation Washingtonian, born and raised actually in Ward 4, where I am running for office. I am a longtime Democrat. I serve on the Democratic State Committee. I've served on the school board. I served on our Ward 4 Democrats. And most recently, I've served as an Assistant Attorney General and the Office of Attorney General for the District of Columbia under Call Racine. And one of the reasons I decided to run has a lot to do with what we talk about in, all of the reasons I decided to run have a lot to do with what we talk about in a Green New Deal. The premise behind needing and wanting a Green New Deal is that we don't just talk about our environmental issues in a silo, but we connect them with the racial justice and economic justice issues. And so when we talk about a Green New Deal, we're talking about a jobs guarantee. In the context of DC, what that means is fighting to make sure that we have good and fair wage jobs for our community here in the District of Columbia. And one fair wage is one of the ways we are able to do that. And one of the reasons that I joined this race, a fair wage for tip workers, which I was able to work as a tip worker throughout my time in law school to help my family survive. And so, you know, when we passed in 2018, Initiative 77, which was a provision to be able to have a fair wage for tip workers, and our council member in our ward voted against it. For me, that doesn't represent a leader who's going to fight for a jobs guarantee, who doesn't represent a leader who's going to make sure that we have fair wages for everyone. When we talk about our environmental justice issues, we have to talk about housing. We have to talk about our homeless population. We have to talk about public housing. We have to talk about what true affordable housing looks like. And in the context of this, when we talk about what a Green New Deal looks like for DC, that means taking in and making sure that our public housing gets the adequate money that they need, the adequate budgeting they need, that they have the adequate materials that they need, and that we are actually doing renovations and making sure that where people are living in our public housing is not in a place where they're going to be disadvantaged from an environmental perspective. We know that when it comes to housing and environmental justice issues, that a disproportionate amount of the impact of greenhouse gases are impacted on Black and brown communities. So when I talk about a Green New Deal, I'm talking about housing. campaign, I'm talking about wages. I'm also talking about how we make this city work for all of us. And so that also comes into when we talk about transit issues, right? I want to make sure that people understand during this COVID crisis, our transit workers are on the front line. Not only that, our front workers who go and work at our Safeways and our restaurants and our industry all rely on public transportation, which is why it's critical that we fight to make sure that we have, we reduce the amount for public transit, and that we fight to make sure that public transit can get to a place where it is free for everyone. When we talk about wanting to meet our clean energy goals, we have to realize that in order for us to do that, we have to have the transit infrastructure in place so that people can go from private cars to depending on our transit system. But right now in Ward 4, our transit system, when we talk about our buses, we got D's and F's across the board in our transit system based on a number of factors, including the amount of times our buses come, the reliability, the distance, the longevity it takes to go from one end of the city to the next. And so in order for us to move our city to a place where people can rely and depend on transit, we're gonna have to take that overhaul. The other thing we have to realize when it comes to transit is that we have to push WMATA to really make sure our clean energy goals are going to be met. Right here in Ward 4, we have the WMATA bus barn, and we have been fighting every day. We have literally a movement here to make sure that the new bus barn on 14th Street is equipped for electrical buses, but also that WMATA upholds the promise to make sure that the buses that are in there will be electrical buses and run on electrical energy. We've already seen them tipping backwards and trying to back out of this and still depending and buying diesel buses. And that just cannot be the case as we move forward. And so for me, I want to be an advocate specifically for a Green New Deal, because I don't think we can talk about environmental justice issues without the context of racial, socioeconomic, and social justice issues. And I think that's how we're going to move forward, and that's how we move forward in this city. And so I thank you for the opportunity. I am proud to be endorsed by the Sierra Club. I am proud to be a No PEPCO pledge candidate and a fair elections candidate, and to have taken the No PEPCO pledge, because I do think we have to get money, especially fossil fuel money, out of our city. And so that's why I was proud to take the No PEPCO pledge. Because I think it's important that we recognize that the business model for Exelon PEPCO doesn't align with our clean energy goals as a city. And so I'm proud to have that, but I'm also proud to have the endorsement from Black Lives Matter, and to have the endorsement from Working Families Party and DC for Democracy, because the coalition that we've built around my campaign has been about bringing together our groups to fight for exactly what a Green New Deal represents. And that is attacking our current system on every single front. And I know that we can do it. I believe that we can do it. And if you can join me in this race, I believe that we will get it done, and we can fight for a city that is running on 100% clean, renewable energy, and that we are fighting for a city that can provide affordable housing for everyone. And we can be in a city where we have free public transit that is reliable, and people will be willing to transfer over into a system of not using and relying on continuing use of greenhouse gases and cars of that nature. And so I want to make sure we bring that into the conversation. And we just saw an example here in DC about how these issues are connected. We worked really hard to make sure that we were replacing our lead pipes in housing. And American University just recently did a study where the families in wealthier neighborhoods in our city were able to replace their lead piping, but the families who were in lower income neighborhoods weren't able to do that. And so we saw that there was an injustice there, where we took into an environmental justice factor, but we didn't take in that economic racial justice factor. And so we had to come back as a city and see that we were able to subsidize and help those families, because they deserve to have clean water as well, to not have lead in their water. Their families deserve not to do that as well. And so I hope that you will join my movement here in Ward 4 to fight for a Green New Deal for DC that takes into account environmental justice, racial justice, and economic justice, and together we can do that. And so I welcome questions at this time, and I thank you for this opportunity.
Great, thanks, Janice. So it looks like we've got one for you from Alexis.
Hi, Janice. Thank you so much. I was wondering if you had any thoughts on rent cancellation during the COVID-19 crisis, and similarly about the permanent solutions proposed by the Reclaim Rent Control Coalition.
Yes, absolutely. I do. And I am proud to be a part of and supporting the Reclaim Rent Control Coalition. It is important that we recognize that our city is over 60% of our city are renters. And we have to do what it takes in this current crisis to make sure that our renters are going to be protected. And so we haven't seen with rent control, one of the things we want to do is open it up to buildings that are 3-unit and 4-unit buildings. So expanding that, we know that the status quo is just going to extend rent control, and we're fighting here to expand it. And so that also includes buildings built before 1975 is the current law. And we want to push that to 2005, which was substantially increase the number of rent controlled apartments available here in our city. In this current crisis, I am absolutely in support of canceling rent payments. I think the economic burden for this crisis should be carried by developers who received hundreds or millions in taxpayer dollars, and the banks who received trillions in federal relief money, not everyday people. And so I think we should cancel rent and shift the burden for seeking relief to corporations who are well positioned to do so, and make sure that that burden is not falling on the tenants right now, who absolutely should not have to carry that burden, as they're carrying many other burdens, which is how they're going to survive and how they're going to be able to feed their families and care and have a roof over their head. And so that's where I stand currently. We need to cancel rent and put the seeking of relief to corporations and people who are well positioned to do so. And I'm in full support of the entire Reclaim Rent Control platform.
Okay, and we got one more question also from Erica.
Mm-hmm.
Hi, Janice. Thank you for joining us today. I don't think that anybody from Brandon Todd's team seems to be on the call right now. And so I was wondering, you did just lay out a lot of, I think, your policies and where you're coming from seem to be very clear. But Brandon Todd is a well-known name in the area. And so I'm wondering, can you take an extra minute to just differentiate yourself, to just explicitly lay out how you will be different from Brandon Todd, just to help us make your case if you'd like to?
Yeah, absolutely. So when it comes to environmental issues, when it comes to Brandon Todd, I'm going to be working for the people of Ward 4. I'm going to be fighting for working families. I got into this race because of those very reasons, where I've seen a lack of leadership from our council member on those fronts. For me, when it came to paid family leave, I fought really hard to make sure for us to pass paid family leave. That was in 2016. I myself had to take unpaid leave to be able to care for my father. And so in the spring of 2016, unfortunately, my father passed away. And I wasn't resentful at all at the fact that, I had to take unpaid leave, but I did become resentful. But that became the fact for so many families having to care for their parents and their spouses and their children and deserving a living wage. And so I went to our current council member to talk to him about that issue and why it was important for me and for other families. And despite my advocacy, he decided to vote against paid family leave. In 2017, right after that was our TOPA rights, our Tenant Opportunity to Purchase Act rights. And I myself personally, when I returned home from college to attend law school here, I was met with the news from my mom that the home that we grew up in on 2nd and Kennedy Street, that the rent had gone up twice and it was going up a third time. And so my mom, even with a good union job, my mom's a postal worker, wasn't able for us to afford to stay there any longer. And so, I took on a job as a tip worker. I took on a job working as a sales clerk at Nordstrom Rack to be able to help my family. And we found a home fast forward 5 years later, the home we found in Ward 4, where I'm sitting at right now, zooming to you from, the owner of that home said, hey, you guys, I'm selling, you gotta go. I said, oh, well, I'm buying. And I exercised my TOPA rights, my tenant opportunity purchase rights, my first right of refusal, was able to purchase that home for my family. And so you can imagine that 7 months later, after exercising those rights, I was absolutely upset when our current council member co-sponsored a bill to take away TOPA rights from single family renters. And despite me telling my story, once again, decided to move forward with that legislation. And then in 2018, I spoke to you about Initiative 77 and how I was a tip worker. And so for me, I knew that $3.89 wasn't enough for families to be able to survive. And so I was a supporter of it. But no matter where people fell on the issue, I say we voted for it as a ward here in Ward 4, and we voted for it as a city. And right after we voted for it, our current council member here in Ward 4 voted to repeal our vote and take away the will of the voters. And so for me in 2016, when it came to paid family leave, our current council member sided with developer interests. When it came to TOPA rights, he sided with developer interests. When it came to Fair Wage Initiative 77, he decided with the big restaurant industries and not the workers. And so for me, I literally went from mad in 2016 to pissed in 2017 to running for office today. And I'm promising everyone here today that the reason I'm doing that is because I promise not to be bought by developers and corporations and Pepco, Exelon, and fossil fuel mergers. I promise to not be bossed by the current administration, but to be a fighter for working families, to be a fighter for environmental justice issues and social justice issues and economic justice issues. And I promise you, if you join in this fight with me, that we can get it done. And I promise you that when it comes to issues like the bike lane, you will not hear me say I'm going to support and then in the back end run around and not do it. I was a supporter of the 9th Street bike lane, and I think we should have put people's lives first. And if ever there's an issue where I don't agree with you, I'm going to come out front to you and say, hey, this is where I stand on the issues. I'm not going to hide after the hearing and not be available for you to tell you why I stood where I stand. When it comes to working with our ANC commissioners, we fought really hard in the Petworth area to have a capital city bike share in a location. And then right after that, there were some people who lobbied, and then they changed that right after that. And so if you want a consistent fighter for working families, working people, you want a consistent fighter for environmental, racial justice, economic justice issues, then Janeese Lewis George for Ward 4 is where you should be. And I welcome you, and we can do this together. Thank you.
Thanks so much. Now that all the candidates have gone, I think that we're going to close with one final question for all the candidates to answer that, I mean, I think really fits this moment. And then we're going to move to the hub members only part of the call to discuss. So the final question, and then we'll go in order for the candidates that presented. So starting with the Ward 2 candidates, is how do we need to restructure our society and economy to be more racially and economically just and sustainable post-COVID?
Should I start?
Yeah.
Well, I think it's a fantastic question. It's the most important question right now. And I think we need to, I think you hear a lot right now from a lot of folks, including on the council and some candidates running for council, that now is the time to sort of tighten our belts, make cuts. You'll hear this sort of quote unquote tough choices type of language, right? But to me, it's actually the time where we need to invest in our priorities and our values, right? In DC, we have a huge rainy day fund. And people said when the economy was going great, you can't do anything with it because you have to wait for a rainy day. The rainy day is now. And you're hearing people say, no, we can't do that. We need to bail out the business community. You know, we need to, they already are pitching hundreds of millions of dollars in tax breaks for themselves as the way we rebuild after this. I think that is the exact wrong approach. I think Sunrise has put out a great approach in the people's bailout, I think, which is a fantastic approach. Put people first. Invest in people. Invest in people getting back on their feet, and unemployment, and making sure people can, as we were talking about before, pay their rent and mortgages. But it's beyond that. It gets to some of the stuff that Janeese was talking about in terms of making sure everyone has paid family and medical leave, making sure everyone has protections in their workplace that are actually enforced. And it gets to, when we're talking about the affordable housing crisis that we have, it's producing not only green buildings, but that people can afford at the extremely low income folks that power our economy. These are the folks that right now people are are describing as sort of the heroes and the backbones. These are our grocery clerks, our transit drivers, all of those folks. Well, a month ago, those were folks that people were dismissing as not deserving a fair wage, not deserving all of these other things. So if there's anything we learn from this crisis, is that we need to invest in people, especially working people. And if we're gonna build a sustainable future, we can't just be giving bailouts to folks or having these overly complicated programs that get gamed by folks. I saw some comments here in the chat about this. We need to center equity in everything that we do. Because if we don't, we end up with these programs that can be very well intentioned, but they have disproportionate impacts on lower income folks and communities of color. And so one thing I will just close, because this is, I think equity, like I said, has to be central. I am a strong supporter of the Racial Equity Achieves Results Act, which has been proposed in the council. And what that would do is say, we need to do a racial equity impact assessment on our entire DC budget, everything that gets proposed, because we need to be thinking about racial equity in everything that we do. It can't just be an add-on or a talking point. It has to be values that we live. And that's how we're going to rebuild better and more progressive and more inclusive and more sustainable than we were before COVID. Thank you.
Thanks. Patrick?
Yeah, I think that, there are very rare opportunities, I think, that comes along maybe once in a lifetime to really, I think, fundamentally change things and use the opportunity of circumstance to pivot things in a better direction. And I think that we're living in one of those times right now. I mean, the changes that we're talking about that we see all around us in society in response to COVID-19 really is unlike anything that I think anybody on this call has ever experienced, and probably unlike anything since maybe the Second World War. And I think that's an opportunity to really redefine society, because I think change takes place when the pain of change is less than the pain of the status quo. And right now, the pain of the status quo is pretty high for people. So, when we're considering things, especially in a federal context, I think what we've seen clearly is that having healthcare tied to your employer is a faulty system. When, your wages can't be replaced by direct government payments, as we're doing in other countries, that's a faulty system. What we see right now in terms of responses at the federal level is so totally inadequate to what the actual scope of the problem is and what we're going to need to do to get past things and really, make sure that our economy doesn't totally crash in the middle of this public health emergency. We see in the disparities in health outcomes from COVID-19, for instance, I think it's something like 75 or 80% of the cases in the District of Columbia are African Americans. I mean, that points to some of the underlying health disparities that we know have always existed in our society. But I mean, this crisis, I think, has had a real way of revealing where the inequities are in our systems, and it's been glaring, and there's really no way to avoid it. It is so apparent across the board. And so I think it forces the issue. I think it forces the federal government and all of the district government, whether it's state, local, to really take a look at their appropriate role and to step in where there's been a clear failure in markets and where there's been a clear failure, I think, in society. But there are other things that I think we can look at what we're doing right now and say, do we really want to go back to the old way of doing business? I look at the pictures, for instance, of Los Angeles, where if you're in Griffith Park, you can see down to Catalina Island. And nobody's had that for 80 years because the smog and the pollution in LA has been so great in the age of the automobile. So, when our economy reboots, do we want to go back to polluted cities, auto dependency, or do we want to seize this as an opportunity to try and do things differently? People now see what we can be in some areas. They can also see where we need to be better. And there are just such rare moments in time where you have opportunities, political opportunities, to, I think, fundamentally change the system for the better. We're in one of those times now. And so, I think for both district government and federal government, it's an opportunity to reset our policymaking frame to be much more cognizant of racial equity, income inequality, and all of the expressions thereof. And I think it's an opportunity to really take what we've seen and move towards a more sustainable future, very specifically, to things that would pertain to the Green New Deal.
Thanks, Patrick.
Thank you, Patrick and Jordan and Janice and everyone else. And for Sunrise for asking such important questions. That's why I respect you guys so much. You ask the tough questions of us and of society. And you're right. That is why in my opening tonight, I spoke about healthcare disparities, something I've been working on for years and seeing for years and talking about for years. It is a top priority for me. I worked in DC at 17th and Q for the Institute for the Advancement of Multicultural and Minority Medicine. It's a mouthful, but it's a lot of work. And so we were working across the city and across this country to address healthcare disparities. And like I said, the ties between climate change and health are so close. The vulnerable communities of our city and our world are the ones most impacted, most harmed by climate change. The ones living at low levels near the water, the ones living in the hotter parts of our cities without enough tree cover, enough infrastructure. And I've seen it with my own eyes, the horrible problems of asthma. Janice, I am so sorry to hear about your cousin. And that should not be happening in our city. And it's happening to kids the most. And it's happening to minority kids the most. It's happening to immigrant kids the most. That is why I am running, to represent these people, to make sure that we do something about it, not just talk about it. I've been working on it for years, and now I want to be in the position to actually change it. Through DC Health Link, we work citywide in the poorest parts of our city. And I will never forget the stories I heard, the people I met, and I will be there for them, not just in Ward 2, but citywide. And we got them health insurance coverage. Now we want to get them health care, but we also need to reduce these healthcare disparities that are causing African Americans to die at such a higher proportion. And it will happen with asthma and diabetes and chronic obstructive pulmonary disease and heart disease. These are problems that I've worked on for years, 15 years of healthcare experience. And I'm following this healthcare crisis very closely because I know the healthcare system in our city very well, whether it be the clinics like Whitman Walker, Mary Center, La Clínica del Pueblo, whether it be the doctors or hospitals at Georgetown, George Washington, Howard, United Medical Center. I've been to all these places. I care about improving the system and making sure we pull out of this crisis. I'm supporting the healthcare workers and the frontline workers, and I know you all will as well. And also, one last thing I'll mention is small business. That's what I did for DC government, was small business outreach to get people enrolled in small businesses and small business employees. So many people who work in small businesses in our city are minorities, and they are out of work right now. You saw with the federal PPP, it was the big players that benefited, the people who could afford lawyers to help them get the loans. That's not how the system's supposed to work. We need to help from the bottom up, the people who really need the help the most. And so I'm going to push to make sure that our tax dollars are spent wisely. That's the oversight I talked about. And I'm going to put my money where my mouth is and make sure we help the people who need it the most. Thank you very much, everybody.
Thanks so much, Kishan.
Thank you.
Janice.
Yeah, this is this moment. We're in a terrible moment. Ward 4 actually has the highest number of cases when it comes to COVID-19 right now. And Patrick's right, there's a big opportunity here to restructure our society in important ways. And the DC economy is struggling, and we need government intervention, and that means that government can condition that support. We can use our government intervention to build a fairer, more equal, more just economy. For me, what this looks like is in healthcare and in the health industry, it means getting a hospital east of the river, which we've been fighting for, a hospital that's going to produce good union jobs. We've been fighting for it, but Ward 7 and Ward 8 have been fighting for years. So for me, it looks like making sure that we have a hospital that is going to support, that's going to have a full trauma center, that's going to have a maternal ward that doesn't continue to add to our maternal crisis, which we know Black women have the highest mortality rate here in DC. as a result of it. It means making sure that St. Elizabeth Hospital, our public hospital, also east of the river, doesn't go without clean water for 17 days for a second time, and patients aren't bathing themselves in water bottles. What it looks like for me, in addition to in the health and education, it looks like closing the digital divide. We've seen it just now, right? Our students have had to go from actually learning in a classroom to learning digitally. And here's the thing, people didn't realize some families can't afford Wi-Fi or internet. Some families can't afford to have computers and laptops. And so for me, it means moving forward in education. We recognize that we have a social economic divide that occurs in our education system. We not only close the digital divide, but we close the budgeting divide and stop creating an education budget that's focused on enrollment only, because it doesn't take into account the unique social economic issues that face each of our school communities. In addition to in health and education, in housing, it means extending and expanding rent control, right? It means ending chronic homelessness and actually having and making sure that we have permanent supportive housing. That's how we move forward. During this whole crisis, everyone's been saying stay at home. Some people don't have homes right here in this community. And so we have an opportunity to end that, to end chronic homelessness and put our money where our mouth is. When it comes to our transit, what have we seen? We rely on our transit system. So moving forward, let's try our best to get free, reliable transit that runs on electrical buses. That's what we see moving forward. We have an opportunity here to dig deep, and we're going to have to restructure our budget, and we're going to have to look at where we're wasting money, where we're not utilizing our money. And we've seen it just now, this past last 3 weeks. Our immigrant communities, right? Our uninsured workers who have been unable to get their resources, and we've had to fight for cash assistance for those families who don't get to connect to those resources. So what it looks like is making sure that we're protecting our immigrant communities and giving them the assistance that they need. And we saw just now the Events DC Fund, which it should have, take some of the money from Events DC and put it towards our immigrant workers and our frontline workers and give them the resources that it needs. So what this looks like looking forward is we have to change the way we do health in our city and make sure that we take the steps to do it. We have to change the way we do education in our city. We have to take the steps we need in housing to put our money where our mouth is, and talk about truly affordable housing. That's families that make less than $50,000 a year. Heck, that's family that makes less than $40,000, $30,000 a year, because that's what's here. So as a city, as we move forward, I don't want to hear any more that we can't address these problems. It is not a matter of can we, it is a matter of will. And we have to make sure that we're electing leaders who are going to have the will and who are going to have the will to fight and to make sure our budget priorities reflect our priorities as a city. And we will stand and fall on that as a city. And it says so much about a city where they put their priorities. Let's make sure that DC stands ahead of the rest and we put all of our families, including our working families, first.
Thanks so much, Janeese, and thank you to all the candidates for taking the time to speak with us today. We truly appreciate your passion and advocacy on this issue. You'll hear from us soon. And thanks to all the about 60 hub members that joined us for this town hall. I know that with all of you working to get our endorsed candidates elected, we can and will win these races. So with that, we're going to move to our hub members only portion of the call to discuss what we do next.